So as we're all settling in, I want to wish you all a super warm welcome to our first Mobilizing Justice Community of Practice session for this year. We're really grateful for all of you for joining this discussion hosted by the Center for Active Transportation, or TCAT. My name is Sophie Callahan. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a project manager here at TCAT, and I'm really excited to be moderating today's session. I know that every time we host one of these, it's a real pleasure seeing so many returning faces, but also new faces logging into the call. And for anyone whose first time it is here with us, I'd like to extend a really warm welcome to this community. So these workshops are typically designed as opportunities to share knowledge and explore strategies to reduce transport poverty and increase modal choice across Canada. Today's conversation has a little bit of a different tone from many of our previous sessions, as we find ourselves in a rather unique moment in Canadian political history. For one, of course, just about, I guess, an hour ago at this point, a new prime minister was sworn in for the first time in a decade. And by no later than October 20th this year, very likely earlier, a new federal election will be held. And at least these days in my conversations about these topics, and I would imagine this is true for a lot of you as well, the federal election has certainly become an undercurrent, whether explicitly or implicitly. And so what exactly is at stake for us coming into this next election cycle, and especially for transportation equity, advocacy, and practice? We have the privilege to be joined today by four panelists whose expertise and experience, I think, make them exceptionally poised to offer some insights onto this question. So I'll give each of you a more proper introduction in a few minutes when we begin the panel portion of the session, but I'll just shout you all out briefly if you just want to wave. We have Matt Peltier, a policy advisor and researcher from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, or FCM. Samuel Benoit, who is the executive director for Vélo Canada Bikes. Nicole Roach, who's the director of Sustainable Mobility at Green Communities Canada, or GCC. And last but certainly not least, we have Sheila Pisey Allen, who is the executive director of TTC Riders. And before anything else, I'll be sure to begin with a land acknowledgement. While we are meeting virtually, TCAT acknowledges that the land on which we operate is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. These sacred lands are covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement forged between the Anishinaabe Nation and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy to peacefully share resources. At TCAT, we recognize that many Indigenous peoples are particularly vulnerable to climate change and will be faster and disproportionately impacted by its effects. Through our work, we're committed to trying to disrupt ongoing approaches to governance that reproduce settler-colonial relations and systematically exclude Indigenous peoples from policymaking. Just a bit more about who I am and who my team is. As I mentioned, I represent the Center for Active Transportation, which is a nonprofit based in Toronto and the organization that hosts these convenings. We're also joined by several other Mobilizing Justice partners and researchers. See some of you, Jasmine and Steve and Nancy, as well as other community members. So TCAT exists to build safer, healthier, and more equitable places, and we do that by working with and supporting communities and creating safer streets for walking and riding bikes. Just a quick agenda for today, so we all know where we're headed. We're going to start things off with the rest of this introduction, including a bit about the Mobilizing Justice project, which has brought us all here today, as well as a short icebreaker. We'll then start the panel portion of today's session with short opening remarks from each of our speakers. And in our speakers' opening remarks, they'll be briefly summarizing their teams or organizations' work, the role that federal policies or program plays in that work, and some of the policies, programs, or approaches that they would like to see the next federal government champion to support a transition to more sustainable and equitable transportation systems for Canadian communities. Following that, I'll look forward to joining them for a group discussion amongst the panelists, and we'll save plenty of time at the end for an audience Q&A before our conclusion. So just to give a bit of background for the context of these sessions, I'll touch on what the Mobilizing Justice project is and what this community of practice is within that. So we convene these webinars as part of the initiatives behind Mobilizing Justice, which is a 5-year project and intersectoral partnership between 33 academics, 14 government agencies, 7 transportation companies, and 7 nonprofits, all across Canada. This coalition exists to better understand and recognize transportation equities in and across Canada. The project is defined by three main objectives, the first being to document the causes, effects, and responses to transportation inequities. The second being to evaluate equitable standards and practices for practitioners seeking to increase transportation equity, and to evaluate pilot projects and initiatives being implemented across the country which seek to improve access to transportation for marginalized communities. So before moving on to our icebreaker, I wanted to touch on what exactly we mean when we talk about transportation or mobility equity. While we could dedicate an entire year of sessions to simply defining this concept, we like Jay Pinder's definition, who has worked on the Mobilizing Justice project with us as a framework for guiding our conversations. Mobility equity strives to ensure that everyone, regardless of race, class, or any other social identity, is able to access safety, joy, and prosperity with dignity while journeying. It's not simply about moving people from point A to point B. Mobility equity is freedom. So with that sentiment, I am gonna introduce some of our favorite tools. We always, at the start of every session, we start with a short poll to get a sense of where we're all coming from, what type of work you do, maybe a fun element, you'll have to see. So to join, I will stop sharing my screen briefly and in a moment and drop the link in the chat. But you can also go to menti.com and enter the code on my screen. That code is 28469516. Again, that code is 28469516. Or you can scan the QR code on the screen. But I will just stop sharing my screen for a moment, since I will have to go over anyway, and then I will just pop that link in the chat. There we go. Not copying over from my slide notes very easily. Always something. Let's see here. I'll just copy it directly from the Menti site. If you just give me 2 moments. There we go. All right, so the Menti link is in the chat. And I'm just going to switch over there and get started. So I see that we already have some eager beavers, early birds, ones of you chiming in and sharing where you're joining from. Here we go. Here we are. So I see we have a fair Ontario bias today. We do have, we have a fair spread though, holistically. That's great to see. Yeah, wow, lots of Quebec and British Columbia as well. Very glad to see representation from certain other parts of the country too. On to our next question. We want to know what mode of transportation you work on. So do we have folks who have a sort of cross-cutting approach to sustainable mobility? Lots of folks in public transit, good mix in active forms of travel, including cycling. Other, always very curious as to what other means. Happy if you pop that in the chat if you're willing. Yeah, this is great. We have really sort of a balance of folks from across these sectors. Yeah, so big emphasis on public transit and AT, which makes good sense. Yeah, but a lot of people also taking a holistic perspective. Great. Move on. We would like to know what type of built environment you work in. So do you work in just one form of built environment? Do you work in downtown environments, urban environments, rural environments, suburbans? We have lots of holistic perspectives here. under all. That's awesome. Yeah, so we have lots of people with multiple forms of built environment. See, we have some integrated thinkers. Always great to see. All right. And this is a sort of free response. We'd like to know what type of organization you're representing. Do you work in advocacy? Do you work in community programming? Do you directly provide services? Are you a partner on the Mobilizing Justice project? Work in research? Government and education, that's great. Lots of advocacy folks here, great to hear. Students, good for you. See some nonprofits mixed in there, NGOs. Different levels of government, that's great to see as well. They works in technology and data. Settlement, community. Great, really sort of all over the board. Yeah, so definitely a kind of focus on advocacy in government, maybe more so than in other sessions, which I think also makes good sense. Okay, move on to the next question. We're just curious whether any of you have attended a previous Mobilizing Justice Community of Practice session. Ooh, lots of newcomers today. That's exciting to see. Wow, real balance. Welcome to so many of you who are newly joining with us. That's fantastic. All right. Wow, that's great. We often don't have such a high proportion of new folks, which is really exciting. We'll move on. All right, so we always, if you have been with us before, you know that we always throw in one slightly more fun question. Spring is here or almost here, depending on which part of the country you're joining from, especially. Pick one of these wildflowers that's native to Canada. Could be your favorite or just one that you're looking at today. All right, the trillium is pulling ahead a little bit. I guess that's sensible since we have a bit of an Ontario bias in our audience today. Yeah, so otherwise we have the brown-eyed Susan. I always called these black-eyed Susans growing up, but I've seen them both ways. So that's how they're reflected there. Aster, Western trillium, blue vervain. I think it's a nice pop of color. Prairie crocus, or none of those. I don't care for whimsy. Seems like everybody here has a bit of whimsy in them based on the results. All right. Well, all of our flowers got some love, but it seems like the Ontarians have shown their preferences in the end today. And then before we transition into the panel portion of our conversation, I would just like you to take a moment in 1 to 3 words and tell us what one of your key areas of concern or hopes is related to transportation equity in the next federal election. We just want to know sort of what has brought you to the session today and what your aspirations are as we enter this period of political shift on the federal level in Canada. Yeah, so a lot of notes about the predictability of funding, continuity of funding, post-secondary support, continuing to try to reduce car dependency, rural transit, very important, safe infrastructure, continuing to prioritize the climate, intercity transit. Yeah, so a lot of different priorities across our group today. Yeah, so funding really being central, infrastructure, including high-speed rail, definitely on people's minds. Yeah, I mean, reform in lots of areas. Yeah, thank you so much for all of your answers. Yeah, great to see your engagement. Bike lanes, how we can help. That's a good question for reflection. Something that I think we'll get to within our session as well. I hope. Public transit. Well, fantastic. Thank you all so much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for the time being. I appreciate you all humoring us in that. So now let's dive in. Why don't we? So I want to start just by giving each of our speakers a proper introduction before they kindly share their opening remarks with us. I'll just maybe ask our speakers who would prefer to go first, and then I can introduce you with your bio before handing the floor to you. Nicole, Samuel, Matt, Sheila, is anybody feeling brave and extra motivated?
I'll do it if no one else does. All
All right.
right,
Thank
I
you,
volunteered myself.
Matt. Excellent. So, Matt, thank you so much for joining us today. Matt, policy advisor and researcher based in Charlottetown, who's done extensive research on public transit, core infrastructure, and housing markets. Matt, you were born and raised in Ottawa, but you've called PEI home since March 2020. And currently, Matt works on FCM's policy and research team supporting organizing municipal infrastructure, public transit, and international trade advocacy efforts. Before working with FCM, Matt worked with the Government of Canada's COVID-19 vaccine procurement unit and the Centre for Greening Government's Green Procurement team. He holds a master's degree in public policy and admin from the London School of Economics and Political Science, or LSE, and a bachelor's degree in public affairs and policy management from Carleton University. And maybe I would just also mention for the audience, as all of our panelists are speaking and throughout our panel discussion, please feel free to pop any questions that you have for our speakers in the chat. I'll be gathering those as we're speaking. There will also be an opportunity to ask questions to our speakers directly at the end of the session. So great. Thanks. Take it away, Matt.
Thanks so much, Sophie. And you know what? I think we made history today. I think we're the first election or policy related work, webinar in with the new prime minister. And so I think we must be like pioneers in this space. So look at us go.
I think that
Um,
could well be. That could well.
yeah. But I'll kick things off by saying that the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, it's the national voice for local governments in Canada. We've got 2,000 members who collectively represent something in around 90% of the Canadian population. So we've got a great range of members who are big cities, small villages, everything in between. As an advisor on the policy and research team, yet my role is to support and lead a number of our files relating to public infrastructure, public transportation, well, actually all aspects of transportation within the federal mandate, and municipal finance. So it's unsurprising that all three of those items have been big focuses of ours in recent months. And they really play a big role in supporting more sustainable and equitable transportation systems. Currently, municipalities are responsible for around 60% of Canada's core public infrastructure. In fact, it's actually a higher share when we're just looking at public and active transportation assets. Despite that, our members only see around 8 to 10 cents on every Canadian tax dollar. So there's a clear fiscal imbalance, and that impacts the people who rely on a lot of these transportation systems most. Think youth, seniors, newcomers, you name it. So, what FCM would like to see the federal government do is provide dedicated funding for urban, rural, and active transportation systems alike, as well as operating funding to support municipal service delivery in general. But beyond that, FCM has been calling on the federal government to convene a conversation with the provinces and the territories to modernize how we fund a lot of these services more broadly. We're thinking, in particularly in the context of a trade war, what we're looking for is what we've called a national prosperity partnership, formerly the Municipal Growth Framework. In June 2024, we released a discussion paper on this broader partnership idea where we outlined some of these core recommendations, which I'll happily get into later on because I think they offer something for every order of government to look at. And as we prepare for a federal election this spring, we're developing a platform that's going to be guided by several priority areas. That includes investing in measures for economic growth, investing in infrastructure renewal, and investing in climate resilient assets. Creating equitable and sustainable transportation systems is going to be a big part of these electoral priorities. And I'm looking forward to elaborating on that a little more in the conversation with my colleagues here today. So I'll pass things back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. Yeah, thank you for sharing the perspectives of this sort of federal level coordinated work on behalf of municipalities across Canada and highlighting some of those issues that you're going to be taking a look at. All right, which of our speakers is feeling like they'd like to go next? I see maybe from Samuel.
I can go
Awesome.
next.
Great. So Samuel Benoit here, Executive Director for Velo Canada Bikes, where he works with members, partners, and the federal government to advance everyday cycling in Canada. He holds a Master's of Social Entrepreneurship from Holt International Business School in San Francisco and an undergrad in Environmental Studies and Geography, also from Carleton University. Thanks so much for joining us, Samuel.
Thank you. So for those who might not know about our organization, Velo Canada Bikes is a national nonprofit working to build a bicycle-friendly Canada. We're the national voice and organizing body for promoting cycling as a means of everyday transportation and recreation. And we do that by working at the federal level and collaborating with all levels of government, industry, academia, and other social sector organizations to improve access to safe cycling for all people in Canada, to promote the bicycle as a transportation mode of choice for moving people and goods. We gather and disseminate the latest knowledge and trends related to cycling. We influence policy and funding for cycling in Canada, and I'll share some more on that. And we educate Canadians on the benefits of cycling, and we support and amplify cycling advocacy efforts across the country, especially with our members. Like Matt explained, while our municipalities have the primary responsibility over our built environment, the nature of our revenue systems means that they tend to be chronically underfunded and need to rely on higher levels of government to achieve their goals. And our organization was established by our members in 2012 with two main policy goals. One was the creation of a national active transportation strategy, and the other was the establishment of a dedicated federal fund for active transportation infrastructure. And this was done in part so that municipalities could access the funds they need to build the infrastructure they need to meet their community's needs. I said needs too many times. In 2020 and 2021, after almost a decade of advocacy, these two goals were achieved. And so I wanted to give a bit of an overview of the active transportation funds, one of these goals. So the $400 million fund was intended to last 5 years, but it received about $3 billion in applications and was fully allocated well before its intended end date, which demonstrates the enormous need for this funding to make more equitable transportation networks across Canada. Since that time in 2022, we've been working really closely with the government and our partners to ensure that the active transportation infrastructure funding continues to flow within what they announced as which is now called the Canada Public Transit Fund. And finally, on December 12th, that the government finally confirmed that active transportation fund will continue under the targeted stream of the Canada Public Transit Fund, which was a huge win. And pending ongoing government support, the continuation of that fund means that there's going to be permanent dedicated federal funding for active transportation infrastructure for years to come. And last month, applications closed for a new round of capital funding, which should see $500 million of funding allocated to infrastructure projects. And so for the upcoming federal election and beyond, one of our big focuses as a small organization is on ensuring that dedicated funding continues to flow. And all of us here know that adequate active transportation infrastructure funding is key for building vibrant, prosperous, healthy, and equitable communities across Canada. And back to you, Sophie.
Thanks so much, Samuel. We'll just also take this moment to highlight a comment from Becca, noting that the capital funds are still open for the Northwest Territories. So thanks so much for spotlighting that, Becca. All right, thank you so much, and Yukon and Nunavut as well. Thank you. Could I ask whether either Sheila or Nicole would like to give their opening remarks next?
I'm happy to jump in.
Wonderful, Sheila. Thank you so much. So Sheila Pisey Allen with us here today, Executive Director of TTC Riders, which is a membership-based advocacy organization that organizes transit users to take collective action for better transit. Organizing trainings and events to involve more transit users in the policy decisions that affect them. Sheila leads campaigns to fix the transit funding model and for accessible, frequent, and dignified public transit that connects all Toronto neighborhoods. Sheila holds a BA from the University of Winnipeg and a joint MA from York University and Toronto Metropolitan University. Sheila, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. And it's great to follow Matt and Samuel, because I think we're all talking about the same thing, which is, dedicated funding from the federal government. And I'm going to talk a lot about the Canada Public Transit Fund. But first, I'll share that, Sophie's already mentioned that TTC Riders is a membership-based transit advocacy organization. So a lot of what we do is try to involve transit riders in decisions affecting them. So in the past year, we focused a lot on reaching out to transit riders at subway stations across Toronto about the need for the federal government to speed up the Canada Public Transit Fund so that Toronto can get its order in for new subway trains. And that's, a big issue that with the Canada Public Transit Fund, it was announced last year in the summer of 2024, or, officially announced, and the details of the 3 funding streams, but the funds aren't going to flow till 2026, which, as we all know, is going to be after the next election. And that's worrying. So I know I'll be a bit Toronto focused, but I think it's something that affects all of us across Canada. But here in Toronto, a major project that the TTC is keen to get moving on is an order for new subway trains. The municipal government, the provincial government have put in their share of funding. And just last week, or maybe it was earlier this week, since time is flying, Nate Erskine-Smith, announced that they've signed some contracts that hopefully locks in the federal government to providing these funds. And I think, I want to talk a little bit about what transit riders have been asking the federal government to change about the fund and what we want to see continue. And the first piece is expanding the fund. Samuel mentioned that, some of the fund is really a repackaging of previous programs in a sense. But the fund is $30 billion over 10 years, which means $3 billion a year that municipalities across Canada are competing over. And just to give that example of the subway train order, it's a $758 million commitment from the federal government. That's 25% of a whole year's funding for all of Canada. So we'd like the fund to be expanded, and it's not arbitrary. There's some modeling done by Environmental Defense and Dunsky Energy and Climate Advisors that was published last year that showed that we could double transit ridership in Canada and reduce climate or carbon emissions by 65 million tons if there was an expansion of funding from the Canada Public Transit Fund and there was matching requirements from provinces and municipalities. So that's why it's so important to expand the fund. The second piece, kind of following what Matt said about operating funding for municipalities, we'd like the fund to be made flexible so that cities have the choice to use it for capital projects or for operations funding for transit. Right now, for example, the TTC is plagued with slow zones on the subway. There's areas that preventative maintenance has fallen behind. The subway is not fast anymore. It slows down to a crawl. And the funding from the federal government can't be used for preventative maintenance, only new capital projects. If it was available for operations, municipalities could also use the funding to more frequent or
Sorry, Sheila, you are just breaking up a tiny bit. Once you come back, we might need to ask you to step back in.
Now, not locking in of a RFP is the best we're going to see. Oh, I'm breaking.
Yeah, so Sheila, you're just breaking up a little bit. And so I don't know about the rest of you, but maybe I would benefit from you taking a couple seconds rewind and moving forward if your internet connection is stable again.
For sure. And maybe I could even turn my camera off.
Sure.
Is that better?
Yeah, that seems to be good.
Awesome. So yeah, just to recap, we've been asking for the Canada Public Transit Fund to be expanded, to be made flexible for operations. But most importantly, we need to ask all the parties if they're going to keep the Canada Public Transit Fund. And one reason we're concerned is that last year, in our effort to speed it along, we invited all parties to sign a pledge for transit that they would, accelerate it, expand it. And we did not hear from the Conservative Party about their commitments on the fund, but we did hear commitments from the Green Party, Liberal Party MPs, the leader of the NDP. And we've met with Conservative MPs about the fund, and they privately expressed their support for transit, but at the party level, we haven't seen the commitment about whether the fund will be kept. So that's a big priority for us going into the election to have that unified message. We need to keep this dedicated fund, expand it, and make it flexible.
Great, thank you so much, Sheila. I know that in particular for me, the sort of projections of what a big impact potentially expanding the fund could make on transit ridership and climate objectives in Canada is quite staggering. And thanks for reflecting on how you hope things will play out to be able to expand and continue that funding. And that leaves us, of course, last but certainly not least, with Nicole Roach. So Nicole, I am very excited that you're joining us today. Nicole is the Director of Sustainable Mobility at Green Communities Canada, or GCC, where she currently oversees large-scale projects related to children's travel, such as school travel planning program in Toronto, the Canadian Electric School Bus Alliance, and the National Active School Streets Initiative. In previous roles, she has led the annual Commuter Challenge event in Manitoba, founded Women in Urbanism in Canada, and managed the Ontario Active School Travel Program, as well as coordinated a national school travel data collection pilot. Nicole holds an honors BA in Philosophy and Communication Studies from McMaster University and an MSc in Sustainability Science, Policy and Society from Maastricht University over in the Netherlands. Nicole, thanks so much for joining us today.
Great, thank you very much. Green Communities Canada, if you're not familiar with us, we're a member-based national environmental nonprofit and charity, and our goal is to support local climate action initiatives. So our departments focus primarily on green infrastructure, energy efficiency, and sustainable mobility. So in our mobility team, we currently focus on children's mobility from an environmental lens, and our programming focuses on school travel planning, school streets, and electric school buses. So similar to the other speakers, today we are also focusing on some key funding sources. So again, like the other panelists, we also have our eyes on the Canada Public Transit Fund. So we are looking at the Active Transportation Fund, but somewhat uniquely, we also work in the electric school buses space. And so we are also very closely following the Zero Emission Transit Fund. We also have an eye on the Healthy Canadians and Communities Fund, which is delivered by the Public Health Agency of Canada. So we're hoping that there will be some continued support for built environment interventions that increase physical activity and other health factors there. And we also have an eye on Environment and Climate Change Canada. They do support clean air initiatives that encourage sustainable transportation and address other traffic-related air pollutants. So we'll be following election platforms related to these key funding sources and also looking for other targets, commitments, and related policies that support our work and just the general goal of equitable, sustainable mobility and thriving communities and all of that good stuff.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your reflections, Nicole. Wonderful. So now we're going to, now that we've had a chance to hear about, the role that federal programming and especially federal funding plays in all of our panelists' work, I'm going to be transitioning us over to a group conversation together. I certainly have a couple of questions that are top of mind coming out of what you've all been saying, and I am excited to sort of dive into those with you. I'll have a couple of questions that each of which are open to any and all of our speakers who have thoughts on the matter. And then I would also, like, while we're having our conversation, I would really welcome audience members to pop any of their questions for our speakers in the chats, or jot them down, make note of them, and in anticipation for an audience Q&A portion once we've had the chance to ask some of my questions to to our panelists. So I also, though, as a sort of transition into a first question that I was hoping to ask you all, I think that Raul Mehta's comment in the chat brings up an important thing that I'd love to get out of the session. First, expressing gratitude for Sheila's advocacy. Raul says that newcomers we serve are highly dependent on transit, as they are across the country. And the commitment to increase investment in that fund is essential for this. So newcomers being just one of the groups that we know are particularly highly impacted by public and active forms of travel compared to other transportation modes. And so my question for our panelists is, how can we best ensure that underrepresented, vulnerable, and marginalized communities are centered in public transit and active transportation projects? And specifically, what steps should the federal government be taking to promote this? Does anybody have any first thoughts they'd like to share on this? Sheila?
Or we could just go in the same order if you prefer. Let me know if my camera, or like if I have a lag, but the first thing I wanted to say, especially given what Rahul wrote, is that operations funding is a really critical policy to make sure that current transit users are getting better service. And we know that, at least, especially here in Toronto, that the majority of transit users are women, are racialized, working class people, more likely to be disabled. And we need to improve the transit we already have for those users. And the way to do that is operations funding for transit. The Canada Public Transit Fund has a number of requirements around housing targets near new transit, mandatory minimum parking requirements, and that's sort of about potential new transit riders. So, when we're, ensuring that there's convenient transit so people don't have to own a car. There's some elements of affordability there for sure. But, some of the ways that the government can ensure that that's happening is they sort of set aspirational targets. They're not necessarily hard targets. And there's also something missing around affordable housing near transit. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the work of Cheryl Case and CP planning, and she uses the term transit-oriented displacement to describe what happens when we encourage housing near transit, but there's no measures to ensure that that's affordable. There can be displacement of working class and racialized tenants, and she's done so much work. I highly encourage everyone to read her report, Black Futures on Eglinton, about the Eglinton Crosstown and that experience. And then the other piece, I think, is around, the targets, I think, that the government could set. So the current climate plan, for example, has targets to increase the sale of zero emission vehicles, but there's not clear targets around increasing ridership or where ridership, increasing ridership and considering sort of the equity analysis of new projects. Like I'm thinking of all the federal funding that's gone to rapid transit expansion here in Toronto that isn't necessarily the most evidence-based transit expansion that would increase ridership. So those are some tools I think the federal government could be using.
Great. Thank you so much, Sheila. I think, you've really touched on something that is important for us to emphasize in discussions about the role of federal governments in sort of steering the agenda and setting examples through targets and creating that sort of consistency in expectations and alignment of goals. And definitely agree that Cheryl Case's work is worth a read for folks in this space. We'll be happy to drop a link to the Black Futures report that you mentioned in the follow-up from this. Great, thank you. I'm wondering if others have either similar, contrasting, other thoughts on this. Yeah, Matt.
Sure, I can build on what Sheila was discussing. So I think like what we found, at least in our experience in our work around how to best achieve this goal, is ensuring that transit projects are being built to exactly reflect where members of these communities live, work, and play. This could include improving the proximity and frequency of these services in lower income communities, looking at routes and trails that pass through post-secondary campuses and retirement communities for youth and seniors, and also better evening and weekend services when we're looking at the commuting patterns of shift workers and women in particular. When it comes to how and what the federal government funds, the federal government obviously can explore a lot of these local land use reform pieces. I'm thinking in the same vein of the Housing Accelerator Fund, and I think largely FCM has seen this as a successful measure in particular. And then obviously the conversation, particularly when we're going to look at the future of the CPTF, or we're going to look at the Canada Housing Infrastructure Fund, what's going to happen in the context of land use there. There's obviously been those conversations as well about parking reform, transit-oriented development, and leveraging public lands near transit for the affordable housing piece. On the operating, and this is a great conversation as well that was raised about the operating funding. When we approached our advocacy on the design of the CPTF, and I know we'll probably discuss that later on, we didn't exactly emphasize operating funding in that piece. We always saw it as sort of an in addition to, but we've had our policy language around operating funding has historically been supporting federal programs that support the expansion and improvement of transit services, but operating dollars for those purposes, improving the delivery of paratransit services. And then another policy point of ours was that was operating funding that was geared to reducing or eliminating fares for marginalized groups, including low-income families, students, and seniors. And most recently, we did adopt a policy recommendation, a resolution through our board that was brought to us by our Alberta members, looking for operating funding to be an eligible contribution or expenditure for the Rural Transit Solutions Fund. While we were told no very quickly by the federal government on that, it's a continued area of advocacy for us.
Great, thank you so much, Matt. That's great to hear the sort of focus of your conversations with your membership on this as well. Wondering, Nicole or Samuel, is there anything that you'd like to add?
Well, we've all been talking quite a bit about the Canada Public Transit Fund, and it's obviously there's for some interests it doesn't have everything that we're looking for, but we all definitely I think we all agree that we want to see it continue and be reliable. And I just want to highlight that it does encourage applicants to do consultation with Indigenous communities and to look at social inclusion benefits. But we might all have work to do at the local level to ensure that our transit agencies and municipalities are doing meaningful work in that area.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Samuel. And it's yeah, thanks also for the perspective of the role of sort of multiple at multiple levels. Great.
I'll jump into about yeah, ATF in particular for funding criteria to help prioritize planning and infrastructure projects in those marginalized communities, but also building in additional budget time and resources to ensure that it's equitable engagement practices being followed. And then where feasible to also try to reduce barriers to applying and reporting, especially for small northern communities with limited resources to apply. And then for the ZETF and electric school buses in particular, great that there's funding available for electric school buses, but a lot of northern Indigenous rural communities just face really significant barriers in terms of their energy infrastructure, charging, all of those challenges, which need to be addressed before they're able to utilize the funding to actually access the electric school buses. And then just more broadly, I think other panelists have spoken about this, but setting more specific targets and providing funding and then actively measuring and tracking that progress towards those goals is really, really key. So for electric school buses, they have a target around medium heavy duty vehicle transition, but nothing about electric school buses in particular. Shifting mode for children is also very important, but it's very, very difficult to track. So data collection is something that we're very passionate about of trying to figure out how to do. And then also similarly, if increasing sustainable mobility uptake in marginalized communities is also an objective, then we also need a dedicated target there and established data collection practices and ways that municipalities and regions can be actively tracking progress on that to ensure some accountability there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nicole. I think that yeah, some of the these more specific examples of the topics that need to be funded or prioritized under this funding is also a good transition to another question that I wanted to be sure to ask for any of our panelists' reflection on, which is yeah, so looking at these major sources of financing, there are yeah sort of structural comments that you've all had about their continuity, their expansion, the sort of allocation of operations budget versus capital budget, and also in terms of sort of like political buy-in and public support for these funds continuing. I'm wondering if anybody else has other thoughts about the types of projects or initiatives that you see as being most pressing for these funds to prioritize for direct impact for equity deserving communities. Yeah, so like Nicole, for example, mentioned that it's it's a great thing, for example, to prioritize electric bus in certain places, but that in certain communities there's a sort of underlying infrastructure need that needs to come first. Yeah, I'm wondering if others have thoughts about this.
I'm happy to jump in, or if I didn't screw up the order again of who speaks first and all that. Okay. So what I will say is, you know, when we're talking about the kind of the existing kind of funding mechanisms that are existing, but also going to come into play in the next year or two. You know, it took a lot of groups, including groups on this call here today, to make the CPTF, even, you know, warts and all, still just a reality. The fact that it's still at least kind of there's been funded, or, you know, sort of profiled money for it that we have announced since a baseline funding has been largely the result of advocacy by, well, ourselves among the groups here at the table here today. And I think we broadly, at least from the FSAM's perspective, we broadly support the vision of CPTF to not just fund one-off projects, but to fund the whole plan, to think beyond one single expansion or one single acquisition. So this means that the land use piece is definitely going to be a part of it. So you get that maximized ridership. So you get those sustainable and equitable outcomes for communities. And I'm glad we're also talking about the Rural Transit Solutions Fund and the Active Transportation Fund and the Zero Emissions Transit Fund, because at least two of those, this is something I didn't realize until a little after Budget 2024. There was funding that was clawed back for both of those funds in Budget 2024. And it was one of these things that I only found out after chatting with a colleague of mine about 2 months later, I was like, oh, well, I should have picked up on that one. And specifically, and I just checked the math again. So $350 million was clawed back from the Zero Emissions Transit Fund in budget 2024. And about 100 million was clawed back from the Rural Transit Solutions Fund in 2024, relative to what the commitments were, 5 years, 4 years prior. So, we're also going to see those funds sunset this year. So obviously, we'd like to see those elements remain in place as part of the targeted stream. We'd like to see some flexibility in that, recognizing that the active transportation needs versus the rural transit needs are going to vary greatly depending on what kind of scope or what kind of size and scope of a community you're looking at. If you have like a very, very large rural municipality, often what they'll be looking for is, say, a bus to help a community group bring seniors to hospital appointments. And you see a lot of case examples of that run by groups like Lions Clubs in rural Newfoundland. So just as a case of, this is what I think a lot of our larger, just geographically larger, that is, rural municipalities would like to see. But recognizing then you also have a lot of urban centers, suburban centers, where I think a lot of those active transportation infrastructure pieces are going to be especially valuable. Think about even the connections to university campuses like we raised earlier. So that's why we've called for this sort of targeted stream to be as flexible as possible to ensure that we can create as many equitable outcomes as possible.
Thanks so much, Matt. Nicole, Samuel, or Sheila?
I will screw up the order again and I'll jump in. So for the Active Transportation Fund in particular, really great to see funding available for planning and infrastructure. But Communities Canada, we're a nonprofit and we represent a number of local community-based nonprofits across the country. So I feel very strongly about local programming activities to also be part of that funding package where possible. So we would love to see programming led by or in partnership with equity-deserving groups and community-based nonprofits, because marginalized communities have different barriers to sustainable mobility that plans and infrastructure alone can't address. So we really see it as like a complementary type thing, that infrastructure goes in and then there's that supportive programming to ensure that it's being used well by those groups who are trying to support. So some examples like Learn to Bike or group rides for new Canadians, bike or walking school buses for children and caregivers, e-bike or fat bike tryout days, bike jams, critical masses, cycling skills education, bike building, donation programs, et cetera, to really get the most out of those infrastructure investments. I think programming is really key to that as well.
Great, thanks so much, Nicole. Yeah, I think you've spoken to an important point about creating and something that builds off of the sort of flexibility of these funds in a role for creating a sort of ecosystem of shifting behaviors and something that can specifically benefit marginalized communities in that. Samuel?
Yeah, I wanted to mention a couple of other things that we should keep an eye on. We're very interested in e-bikes and cargo bikes right now. We think that they can have a huge potential in advancing transportation equity. But in order to do that, we're going to need clear and supportive regulations across every jurisdiction. So that's gonna relate to making sure that only safe and reliable e-bikes are sold, so that Canadians, can have more trust in them, and developing fair rules for their use, and making them accessible through things like subsidies and public e-bike sharing programs. So it's something else that we're working on. And another interesting program that we should keep an eye on is the Environmental Damages Fund. You might not have caught it, but this week there was a really positive announcement from the federal government of $3 million of funding to several different programs in Quebec. Most like their cycling and active transportation programs, including to Velo Quebec, and Louis Lalonde is here on the call from Velo Quebec. So the Environmental Damages Fund is a federal fund that it reallocates monies that come in from environmental fines and penalties. So something else that is available.
Yeah, thank you, Samuel, for that piece of positive news and for spotlighting those other priorities like focusing on e-bikes and cargo bikes as being particularly impactful levers potentially. Sheila.
Yeah, I just especially wanted to pick up on what you said, Samuel, about e-bikes because it is connecting here in Toronto. The TTC has banned e-bikes and e-scooters from November to April, which has a huge equity impact on gig workers who are mostly racialized and newcomers. And I think, yeah, what you said is so important. Together with Cycle Toronto, I see Allison here on the call and other groups, we did, try to encourage the agency to think about regulating companies that are exploiting gig workers and not needing to provide them with safe batteries. And then also, of course, it's a regulatory issue. So that's sort of a way that those issues are connecting around equity. Yeah, the only thing just around your question about what types of projects, like just a very local example, but here there's two transit priority projects the City of Toronto is interested in advancing. There's the Downtown Waterfront East LRT, which has a lot of support from major institutions, and then the Eglinton East LRT, which has some support from the University of Toronto Scarborough campus, but otherwise, has really languished. But that's the project that would serve most equity deserving communities. So yeah, it's there's not enough money to go around right now. So how are we going to prioritize it and prioritize projects? And there's ridership considerations and there's equity considerations. And I think those are both important. I know that it's the city that has to make the ask and prioritize, but the federal government should be using levers like what's already in the Canada Public Transit Fund, but really making it a requirement and focusing on mode shift and ridership and equity.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sheila. Also for some concrete examples that, as you said earlier, even if they're specific to Toronto, which is a local example for lots of folks on the call today, it's examples of the kinds of priorities that I know other Canadian cities will be seeing as well. And yeah, I think that you both you and Matt, especially, but other speakers as well, pointed to the need for coherence in related regulations and a supportive environment from multiple government levels. As we spotted in our opening mentee about the sectors that you all belong to in the call, we saw definitely multiple levels of government, but we also saw, in addition to municipalities maybe being the biggest groups, we saw lots of folks from grassroots groups and civil society organizations. We saw academics, a lot of whom are represented through the Mobilizing Justice Initiative itself. I wanted to ask our panelists for their thoughts on the role that you see some of these other actors playing as being effective advocates for federal support for local transportation equity initiatives. So in other words, what can we do as a community here among us who are involved in mobilizing justice, new or more longstanding members, to promote transportation equity in the face of changing governments?
I can jump in.
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it, Sam.
I think that if we're going to be effective, I think there's a lot we can do, and what we have, we should recognize that what we have is as a result of of our efforts and in civil society and our advocacy and research work. And I think in order to continue to be effective, we're going to need to connect with elected representatives from across the political spectrum. And to do that, I think we need to be prepared with arguments and evidence that are catered to the specific priorities of whoever we're speaking with. And the good news is that transportation equity serves many interests, health, accessibility, safety, affordability, the economy, the environment, and yes, relieving congestion. So, we can speak to whatever they're interested in to try to keep advancing this work. And I think we also need to educate the public on the value of transit and active transportation so that they're then in a position to support the leaders who are going to support them. And something Nicole mentioned, and I want to reiterate, is that we can We can all support this work through our research and by generating data, and there's a lot of researchers and even small nonprofits like ours are engaged in generating the data and mobilizing it to advance this work.
Great, thank you, Samuel. I appreciate your perspective on being realistic that there are different perspectives that and different messaging that might be necessary as we advance this work, and really emphasizing the key role that multiple different sectors can play in supporting each other in advancing the data and the conversation in a way that creates cohesion and potentially unlikely partnerships in some cases. Great. And Sheila or Matt or Nicole, any thoughts to share on this?
Sure. I can maybe say, at an individual level, certainly, it's very important to be asking your candidates when they come to your door, if you attend any town halls, about their commitments to continue the Canada Public Transit Fund, expand it. And then at an organizational level, I did want to share and then just, see what others are planning on this call. Including the panelists, but that TTC Riders is part of a coalition called the Keep Transit Moving Coalition. We also sometimes work with other, nonprofit organizations in the sort of transportation space. And we are planning a survey, just very simple. Will you keep the Canada Public Transit Fund? Will you expand it? Will you make it flexible? And I forgot to mention that we shared a similar survey to Liberal leadership candidates, and we 50% of them responded, not the winning candidate, unfortunately. But yeah, just a nonpartisan survey so that we can, and be as unified as possible. So if any groups don't have plans yet in the election, and the Canada Public Transit Fund is something you want to, help show that there's a diversity of voices that really believe in the need for this stable funding, the need to expand it, then I would love to connect with you and also just hear what other tactics you're thinking about to make this an election issue.
From an organizational standpoint, I think that a lot of groups here can just kind of consider what are going to be the broader ballot box issues for Canadian voters coming up in this election. Prior to, we'll call it the big trade war, I think the big things we were finding were in terms of like the kind of the third rail issues for Canadian voters from our work that was more in the context of sort of the public transit file. The four big issues we were finding were housing, homelessness, public safety, and congestion. Those seem to be big, these were galvanizing voters, particularly voters that are on the fence about which party to vote for. So I think if there's a way, whether it's packaging the CPTF as a mechanism for fighting some combination, if not all four of those issues, like this machine kills traffic, this machine kills it kills our debilitating issues around, say, prosperity. It allows us to boost our productivity, prosperity. It helps us create these safer trips everywhere. There's a way to do like this in a way that actually kind of keeps us. That keeps the conversation alive around public transit in a big way, a really helpful way across the spectrum. Now, when you factor in the trade war tariff piece, which will probably become the big issue, so everything I told you in the last 30 seconds might just be a moot point. Where it could be an angle is that investing in infrastructure being an avenue for stimulus spending. So if we see like the continuation of the 25% tariffs after April 2nd. And, my betting odds right now, it's a coin toss. And we'll see the additional ones around, the copper is going to come in. There's going to be copper tariffs April 2nd. We're going to see reciprocal tariffs on the digital services taxes, on dairy, you name it. There's a bunch of things that are possibly / likely going to hit us on April 2nd. And we're going to be retaliating as a country. We're also going to be looking at how we approach the issues, how we support unemployed people during this time, how we support our industries. So the idea of stimulus spending in the context of infrastructure, in the context of transportation, in the context of almost that kind of COVID style stimulus to support our economy, that's going to be a very live conversation again. And I think you might see more of a, I'll call it like a fiscal dovishness across the board to this part, if not from a populist standpoint from the different parties, certainly from the idea of, yeah, I don't want my riding to go under. I don't want the people in my community to lose their work and opportunities. So that was my thinking across the board for those ones.
Yeah, thanks so much, Matt, for highlighting potentially some of the sort of angles, talking points, and sort of key issues that advocates kind of across different sectors might be able to sort of zoom in on to have this cohesive and kind of, yeah, a bit of universally resonant messaging, especially in these so many layers of weird political times. So yeah, Nicole or Samuel, would you like to share any of your thoughts before I move on to sharing some of the questions that the audience has been putting in the chat?
My comments were pretty similar to what Samuel already shared, that there are so many benefits around sustainable mobility. So there are a lot of opportunities to identify what issues people are passionate about. And I think pretty much everything we can connect to how sustainable mobility investments and priority will benefit everyone and address those issues that they're really passionate about. And then also back to data collection with continuing to build that evidence base so we can make a stronger case of how those issues connect.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, any last thoughts on that question from anybody before I spotlight some of the questions from the chat? Happy to field over to some what I think will be questions from the audience that I think could warrant their whole other session in terms of depth of content. I'm going to just change my speaker view. So I'll just start off with two, I think, kind of related questions. A lot of our discussion today has been focused around the prospect of expanding funding through these major federal funding sources for active transportation and for public transit. And as I think Sheila also especially alluded to in your remarks, that's a prospect that comes with other complications and other questions. It's about where do we actually get that expanded funding from? That's definitely a question that's on top of planners' minds and people who think about this kind of programming a lot. So, for example, Eric Doherty from the audience said, I'm wondering which groups are explicitly calling for the federal government to implement their 2016 commitment to shifting funding from parentheses high carbon highway expansion to public transit and active transportation, citing some examples and some other thoughts. And then kind of along a similar vein, but different source to potentially be pulled from, Raul Mehta asks, is there or should there be a push to shift incentives and subsidies from electric vehicles, parentheses, in the tens of billions, to active mobility and transit investments? Has that angle been tried as a way to persuade multiple parties to commit to increased funding without necessarily increasing overall budgets?
I can potentially answer a bit on both of these questions here.
Great, thanks.
So, it's a good question on the highway piece, because we'd been kind of tracking it off the sides of our desk when last year a minister said that there was no longer to be any funding for highways. And, a number of our urban members, they're a big contingent of our groups. And obviously this is something they're live to, if they're on the funding piece or the funding conversation around, should you be funding major urban transit capital projects while also funding a highway in a city center that might necessarily offset the ridership? So there is that conversation happening there. Trouble is, the bulk of our membership, they're rural, they're northern, they're remote. A highway is often your only lifeline in and out of your community, like an all-season highway, or it's a winter road, particularly the more north you go. And I think about where my brother lives in Iqaluit, that's definitely kind of a big conversation the more remote you go. For what it's worth, it ended up being a bit of like I'll call it a moot point when we looked at the spending that was happening by the federal government on highways and roads within the context of the approved projects on Infrastructure Canada's database. I'm looking at just some numbers from 2016. It was just shy of $2 billion in approved funding per year. But then by 2020, that figure dropped to well below $500,000. I think it's around 200 million. I just haven't put the margin, I haven't put the axis below 500, so I can't tell you precisely how much. But the point is, it's very much dropped off in terms of approved federal spending, for at least the federal government spending on highways in the past few years. And almost the entirety, I'd say actually the entirety of the federal spending, at least through the application-based funding for highways, came through the rural and northern stream of ISIP. So there's not a lot of direct federal investment into at least those big superhighway expansions, widening of lanes, et cetera, because this funding would also include state of repair funding for existing highways, not just building out new ones. And then the other mechanism where a lot of the funding for highways could theoretically come from was the Canada Community Building Fund, formerly the Gas Tax Fund. But even then, that is a fund with a volume of something in the range of $2.5 billion each year. There's a bit of an escalator, and that's divided between a myriad of eligible project categories. So when you talk about planning costs, fire halls. In the case of Toronto, for instance, all that money goes into the TTC directly. So the actual federal funding for highways and roads has not been significant by our view, and it's actually diminished since Trudeau first took power. So it's a marginal difference. It's a marginal amount now and a significant decrease from 10 years prior.
Yeah, thanks so much, Matt, for giving an overview about those trends in in highways funding. If you or others have thoughts about funding for EVs, incentives or subsidies, also welcome that. Yeah, Samuel?
I just want to, maybe I'll share a link. There was a really interesting report that came from Affordability Action Council. So this was something that was brought together by the Institute for Research on Public Policy, and it's a really interesting report that has a number of interesting recommendations that ties connections between affordability, housing, climate, transportation. And there's a strong argument in there for the value for an e-bike subsidies in comparison to EV subsidies. EVs are quite expensive. Cars alone are quite expensive, whereas a subsidy towards electric bikes has the potential to spread quite a bit further and help many more Canadians improve their transportation. So I'll put the link into the report. It's a lot of interesting recommendations.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Samuel. We're about 15 minutes away from the end of our session, and there will be a few sort of checkout questions that I'll want to be asking you all back on Menti. I would love to leave the floor open, even if we don't have quite a lot of time because of the depth of the conversations we've been having. Please just feel free to raise your hand in the audience if you have other questions for any of our speakers. Otherwise,
Well, I could just jump in quickly and provide context on the other piece, because I realized I didn't answer the second question about the kind of the reprofile, or kind of the reprofiling of funding there. That has been a conversation potentially within the federal circles, more so I would say in the past year when interest rates were a little higher, there was a little less there was more of an ambivalence from the federal purse side of things to spend more. identifying potentially what are some funds or programs that have not been fully allocated or are undersubscribed, and what about kind of shoring up resources in that space. And I think about even the context of a fund like the Zero Emissions Transit Fund that likely was cut in funding just because of a lot of the kind of structural issues relating to it, the capacity issues relating to EV buses in Canada. I know there are folks on this call who know about a lot of the issues that happen in this space. And I think about even where I live on Prince Edward Island, there was a plan to get the school buses fully electrified, and that ended up falling through because of shortcomings relating to the fund itself. And then you actually had the point where the province just said, okay, you know what, we're going to go for, I believe it was like a hybrid option for their buses. So the electrification plans were effectively shelved.
Great, thanks, Matt, for that perspective. Yeah, so Nicole, I'd welcome your thoughts on that, but I also would like to give some chances for other audience members. So we'll go Navdeep and then Becca after that, and then we'll move to closing.
Oh, sorry, that was me to go first. Thanks. Yeah, just wanted to jump in on the EV electric school bus conversation. So we are currently working on a research report focused on equity in the transition towards electric school buses. So we're publishing that in the spring, and there's a lot of equity concerns when it comes to any like resource extraction and affordability with electrification. So we definitely prioritize any like shared mobility options over like individual private vehicles for that transition. So that's where we stand, and a lot more information is going to be available on that soon.
Great, thanks so much, Nicole. Navdeep. Sorry, Navdeep, I think you are muted.
Thank you. Yes, I was trying to figure out how to unmute. First up, thank you everyone for sharing your thoughts, insights. It was really wonderful to see how many people across the country are galvanized to continue making active transportation more accessible and equitable. I want to share some of my concerns as well. One, we cannot have equity without representation. We cannot have sessions where there is no representation in any meaningful way of any marginalized communities. This is critical. When I join a session on equity, I would like to hear from people who have been equity denied for a long time to learn to their views. This is especially important for Indigenous nations. Many of us acknowledge the unceded lands we live on from different Indigenous nations across the country, but there was no voice anywhere in any conversation about those communities, what they want from them. Secondly, people who have any kind of mobility challenge, they need to be at the stage sharing what their challenges are, what their needs are. People in wheelchairs, people with sight loss, people with hearing disabilities, people whose disabilities we cannot see. Privileged people like me, able-bodied like me, could not continue to take that space away from them. We have to create space for them. We are not allies till we bring them to the table and give them the space to speak. The last thing I want to say is we need to be mindful of the challenges we face. Yes, active transportation brings great benefits, health, environment, and so many other things. But we must also remember that marginalized people are being sold different dreams. When they watch TV, they are told to buy that new car. We have to bring leaders from those communities to speak up and share their real concerns. And we cannot have equity till we have all of those people on the stage.
Yeah, thanks so much, Navdeep, for sharing your perspectives, and also these very resonant calls to action for us, regardless of the sector or area or level of governance that we're all working in here at the in this community of practice, and also beyond for mobilizing justice. It's I think that's it's really important to not lose the thread of yeah, also some of those structural barriers that keep groups like that out of decision-making spaces. So thank you. Yeah, unless any of our speakers want to add anything or specifically say something in the interest of yeah, having other audience members be able to ask questions, I would go over to Becca.
Hi, thanks so much. I wanted to expand a little bit on the EV subsidies that was just discussed, in particular with regards to the NWT, which had both EV subsidies as well as e-bike subsidies in 2023. And then in 2024, much to our dismay, they took away the e-bike subsidies to save some money. It was an extremely successful subsidy, by the way. Like, it sold out within like weeks. But they took it away in 2024, and we asked, like, why did you do this? It was such a successful program. Why keep the e-vehicle in there? And one of the comments that we received back was that they couldn't quite track if people were actually no longer using their vehicles and using the e-bikes for maybe they were just using it for pleasure or something. And so they wanted to have some sort of assurance that that was happening. And of course, we talk about data collection that could have happened. But one thought that we had is e-cargo bikes seem to be a model that might help people like the NWT to actually say, okay, yes, if we're helping a family to afford an e-cargo bike, there's a better chance that they're not going to then take on buy a van, for example. It becomes that replacement piece that maybe they were looking for. So this is something that we're going to be trying to talk to them about. And I thought I'd mention that in this realm because that could be an initiative that other places might want to do as well.
Great, Becca. Thank you so much for sharing how that conversation went in a sort of applied example of when those sorts of funds were being shifted and suggestions for maybe e-cargo bikes as a common ground in that. Yeah, if any of our speakers have anything to add to Becca's comments, otherwise I'll start referring people back to our mentee.
I can quickly add to what Becca said. Becca, we had in British Columbia an income-tested e-bike rebate program that the provincial government had for 1 year. The website crashed and they were oversubscribed within end of the day. But as part of the grant, people had to commit to share data. So the provincial government is working with the University of British Columbia to track the usage of e-bikes. And if you want, I can connect you with the people doing that research and tracking that. This year, after 2 years, the provincial government quietly added more money to the grant program to just give us grants to people who had already applied. But it is even more income tested now in terms that earlier everybody could get if they got on the list somehow, but there was less, the amount they got in rebate was less. But now only people who really need it are getting in the next round of rebates. But like you said, we have been pushing car subsidies for electric cars don't come out and go away. They are just there for quite some time. While cycling, which is a very small amount, is less. And also for cargo bikes, which can be, or other non-traditional bikes could be more important for mobility needs.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Navdeep. It's always really exciting to see the community of practice space being a sort of practical space for sharing insights and setting up these kinds of collaborations. For the sake of time for the people who are attending this more for a sort of webinar format, I'm going to switch to the mentee, but I'm seeing a lot of activation in the chat as well. What I would propose I do, after I run the closing mentee, I'm just going to stop the recording and I'll leave this meeting room open if anybody just wants to kind of chit chat and continue some of these conversations. I'll just make sure while you do that my team doesn't need our link for something else. But yeah, definitely don't want to shut down some of these great conversations. And yeah, I'll also just take a second to give a really warm thanks to our panelists for all of their incredible contributions. I thought our discussion somehow reached a lot of breadth and depth in our topics, with lots of concrete examples of how these issues play out on local levels and some of these bigger picture trends. And I think, yeah, it's clear that we've had a really enriching discussion. And yes, absolutely, that the room being left open doesn't mean that you all have to stay, just anybody who wants to. All right, so I'm just going to take a second to go over to our mentee. Here we go. So we're always just sure to ask a couple of checkout questions so that we can continue to improve these sessions in the future. I see some of you already had the Menti poll up. That's fantastic. Maybe I would just ask if somebody has the link handy to the Menti, just to pop that link back in the chat in case people have lost track of it. Otherwise, you can join at menti.com and use the code on the screen, 2846-9516. So we'd like to know whether this workshop deepened your understanding of transport equity and justice. This is anonymous, so please. And we want to improve. So we're excited about your honest input. Looks like the answers are sort of tapering off. Thank you. I spoke too soon. We'll give people a few more moments, since I think some folks will be rejoining the Menti. Okay, thanks so much. There we go. And we're wondering if you found the information that we shared useful or applicable to your work. Great. I mean, we do welcome constructive criticism, as I said, but it's also great to see that, this, at least for a number of you, this is useful information. Great. And we're wondering if the workshop format gave you the opportunity to share and learn. Great, very glad to hear. And then finally, feel free to share any thoughts, suggestions, or concerns you'd like us to know about the session. I can leave this up for a bit, but as it is 1 minute past, I'll maybe leave this up for slightly less time. You can still access the Menti for several days afterwards, and I'll just keep it live to this page so you can share things. Yeah, well, at least for now, thank you for the kind words for the great workshop. In the interest of time, I won't go too much into this, but I did just want to spotlight that we will be hosting 4 more community of practice sessions over the course of 2025. I've just put some of the topics that you can look forward to, but we will provide more information in follow-up communications. And yeah, just be sure to keep an eye on things. How can you keep an eye on future updates and other session opportunities? If you are new to the Mobilizing Justice Community of Practice, if this is your first webinar, we have a newsletter that's the most reliable source for this. And if you're not already subscribed, I'll be sending a thank you for participating email just back to you, to everybody who registered, and you'll get a subscription link in there, and we can keep in touch that way. So I will just go back to the last question just to leave things open. And then will just stop sharing for now to say a warm goodbye. Yeah, thank you all so much for all of your time and perspectives.